In this companion demonstration video regarding Multi-Site Orchestrator, I want to show you a couple of interesting things. What I intend to show you in this demo is first to begin with a discussion around the Multi-Site Orchestrator form factors used in this demonstration. Then I'll show you how to set up the infra using Multi-Site Orchestrator itself. Then I'll move on to showing you how to do backup and restore using Multi-Site Orchestrator, and I'll use that backup file for the purposes of a migration from one cluster to a new cluster. And then finally, I'll show you just how easy it is to do a firmware upgrade right inside the UI of MSO. In my lab, I'm going to begin with a version of Multi-Site Orchestrator using what's called the OVA form factor. So this is just MSO nodes running on an OVA on an ESX hypervisor as shown in this image here. I'm going to do all the configuration around the infra for the demo, but what I will do is then I will migrate to a brand new Multi-Site Orchestrator cluster running MSO ACI version 3.0 something. Now this is a newer architecture that's running on the application services engine, and in my particular case I'm running the virtual application services engine, and then I install the MSO.ACI app on top of that. Going forward, this will be the recommended way that you deploy MSO, so I wanted to show it to you in this demo. With that being said, let's talk a little bit about what we need to do to set up what we call infra in MSO. So let's begin with a really quick review about some of the IP addresses and interfaces that you need to be aware of when you first set up your site to connect to an inter-site network. The spines play a key role here, and they have two main functions. So the first is the spine will be the ones that will establish MPBGP EVPN peerings with any other participating spines in the remote site. Now, we can control which spines participate in a multi-site network when we configure the infra options in MSO, and I'll show that to you in a little bit. Each participating spine will have an EVPN router ID that we'll use as a control plane address. This is what will be used by MPBGP. Second, there are a pair of TEP addresses that we use for data plane purposes. And the first one is an Anycast overlay TEP, or O-U TEP. And this will be a single address that will exist on all participating spines at the same time. And it will be, of course, used to send unicast traffic. The second TEP that again exists on all participating spines is the Anycast overlay multicast TEP, or O-M TEP. And this is a special address that will be used to send head-end replication and multicast traffic and bump traffic. It should be pointed out that all of the addresses that I highlight need to be routable across your inter-site network. With that being said, I just want to remind you of the topology that I have set up in my lab that I'll be using for this demo. If we look on the left, we have site number 1, which is represented by AMS or Amsterdam. It will have a single spine, a number of leaves, and a single APIC. That spine is connected to a device that I have named IPN-West. This will be my inter-site network routable device here. If we look on the right, we have site 2, which is represented by Barcelona, which has its own spine and pair of leaves and its own independent APIC managing that site. I've already pre-installed the MSO cluster in the middle. I do want to point out that my lab is not an example of a production setup. You can see that at many levels I'm missing redundancy. Usually you would have at least a pair of spines in each side, 3 APICs. You definitely want to have redundancy in any devices that are serving your inter-site network, but this is what I have in my lab and it's suitable for our purposes of this video. Let's prepare things ahead of time. So if we just hone in on site number 1, there's a couple of things that we need to kind of decide before we actually start the configuration, and mostly that's just picking some IP addresses for the purposes that I just described. First, we're going to need an IP address on the spine link that's facing towards the inter-site network. We're going to need to pick some EVPN router IDs that will also be loopbacks, and I'll show you that in the configuration. And of course, we're going to have to pick our TEP addresses, one for multicast and one for unicast. And as I mentioned, these are routable across the ISN. If we take a look at site number 2, it's exactly the same. We've never done multi-site on either of these sites before, so we're going to need to have different addresses for the purposes of site number 2 connecting up to the ISN. And I personally like to create a cheat sheet for myself. So when it comes time to configuration, I've got everything chosen, I've got everything written down, and it becomes an easy chore of cutting and pasting when I configure the infra in MSO itself. So these are the addresses that I've chosen. And I just want to point out that I have chosen random addresses that I don't actually own just for the purposes of easy example. I strongly suggest that you pick IP addresses that are specific to your environment and of course that you control and own. When we go through the infrastructure configuration in MSO and it's all done, what will happen, and I'll show this to you in APIC, is MSO will automatically create and configure a layer 3 out under tenant infra. Okay, let's get to the configuration part. But before I log into MSO, let's have a quick view at one of the APICs, in this case the APIC managing site number 1 AMS. And I'm in the Tenants tab and I'm looking at Tenant Infra. And under the networking area, you can actually see that there are currently no configured layer 3 outs. And the reason why I point that out is because once I configure all the infra settings in MSO, it will automatically push a fully configured and working layer 3 out to each of the participating sites. And I'll quickly remind you that I have already pre-configured the inter-site network that I showed you in the last video, but I show it here again just to remind you of the settings that I chose. Here I am logged into my multi-site orchestrator for the very first time. And I'll remind you, this is the multi-site orchestrator running on the OVA on version 2.2.4. So when you first log in, it prompts you to begin by adding sites. So let's go ahead and do that by clicking on Add Your First Site. So I've quickly pre-populated all of the fields that you need to bring this site into MSO. I started by giving it a name, in this case AMS. Then I give it an APIC controller URL. This is for any APICs that are managing a given site. Now in my lab, I only have one. Normally you would have 3 or more, and you would want to add all 3 by clicking on the little plus sign and adding your other 2 APIC controllers. Next, I gave it admin level read-write privileges because MSO does need to push configuration to any sites that are participating. And then finally, you give it a site ID, and if this is your first site, just go ahead and pick one. After clicking save, you're presented with an optional map view, and this is where you can drop a pin that represents the location of your given site. So if I zoom into the Netherlands, I'm going to give it a guess about where Amsterdam might be. So I'm going to say right about there, and I'll click finish. And that's how easy it is to add sites into MSO. We can see that we've got a successful connection to the Amsterdam APIC. We can actually see which version of ACI this particular site is running, and so on. What I'm going to quickly do is add the second site, BCN. So just like before, I've pre-populated all of the sites, and it's exactly like Amsterdam, of course, with the controller URL being a unique value, and this being identified as site number 2. And just like before, we can optionally drop a pin on the map which represents the location of this site. So I'm going to guess that Barcelona is probably right about there. And there we go. We have very easily added the sites into MSO. This establishes a connection between MSO and the APIC to push configuration changes later. For example, I'm about to configure the infra in MSO, which will then get pushed to APICs. So to configure the infra, still in the sites view in MSO, I can just click on the button actually called Configure Infra. Now the first screen you see are options for general settings around control plane. If you don't have a good reason to change, don't change any of the defaults, just keep them as they are. You can also see on the left that we have a list of all the sites that we've added, and let's click on each of the sites and then configure the infra that we require. So clicking on site number 1, represented by AMS, you can see the configuration options that we have. It's useful to know that there are 3 levels of configuration that we need to address. One is at the site level, which is the view that you see now. The second is clicking into the pod level, showing pod-specific level configuration. And the third level is any of the participating spines have their own set of configuration. So let's click back up into the site level. The first thing that we need to do is actually turn on multi-site for this given site by hitting the button. Now, MSO will actually pull existing information that exists in any APICs for this site. For example, the autonomous system number. Any box that is in red is a box that you as the admin have to fill out. If you remember back from the cheat sheet, I had all these addresses laid out, so now it just becomes as easy as copy and paste. So if you remember from my cheat sheet, this is the IP address that I chose for the overlay multicast step. A little bit further down, we need to set up some OSPF options here. So the first one is setting up the OSPF area ID. Now in my particular lab setup, I have chosen the area ID of 0, so I'll fill that in. The next thing is we need to tell MSO what sort of OSPF area has been pre-configured. And again, in my lab, I chose a regular area. Now down here you have the choice for external routed domain. Now this is an optional thing. You don't need it to complete the configuration, but you may see a fault show up in APIC because we haven't configured the spine access level ports to connect to the ISN. Now it's all going to work if you leave this field blank, but just wanted to warn you that you may get a fault. When I add site number 2, I'll show you that I had one of those pre-configured and it's just as easy as selecting it. A little bit further down, we have OSPF policies. Now there's a policy that MSO gives you out of the box that I'm going to use, but I'm going to modify it because I have some specific settings in my lab that I prefer. So clicking on the policy, you can see the settings here and the things that I want to add. And again, these are things that I choose to run in my laboratory, so these are optional. But in my lab, I use BFD and I use MTU ignore because I want to make sure that the OSPF neighbor comes up without bothering to match MTUs just in case, right? But that's my preference. Then we can click down to the pod level, and the pod level is pretty easy because you just need to enter one thing. From the cheat sheet, you'll remember that I chose a specific address for the overlay unicast TEP, which I'll fill in here. So 11.20 was the address that I chose for the overlay unicast TEP, and really that's all I need to do at this level. Then finally, I'm going to click down into the spine level. Any spines that you want to participate in multi-site will show up here. And if you remember, in my lab, I only have one. The first thing you need to do is you need to tell MSO which specific interface on the spine is the one connected to the intersite network device. So you can do that by clicking on Add Port to the right. So I've quickly filled in all of the pieces of information that I need to complete this part of the configuration. If you remember from my cheat sheet, it's Ethernet on the spine, port 1/20. I have an IP address that I copied from the cheat sheet. I've chosen the MTU option inherit. You can actually specify a number if you desire. And then finally, my OSPF policy that I modified just a few seconds before. You do have the option for OSPF authentication. In my particular setup, I don't use authentication, so I'll leave it marked as none. Now, there is one more piece of information that you need to tell MSO, and it has to do with BGP peering. You can see here by default it's off, but we want to enable it by sliding the button to the right. And then finally, we need to give a BGP eVPN router ID. Now, I mentioned this earlier, and from my cheat sheet, I have chosen an address for this purpose. So I filled in the address of the router ID that I've specified for the one and only spine in my lab setup in site number 1, and that happens to be 111.111. And then finally, you have this option here of spine is a route reflector. Now, normally I leave that to off, and let me explain why. Imagine you have a bunch of sites, like 5, 6 or more sites, and they're all in the same autonomous system number, but you don't want all of the spines in all of the sites to be establishing BGP peerings with each other, because that could be an excessive number of peerings. But what you want to do is you just want to choose a smaller number of spines to act as route reflectors. This is where you want to enable that feature. Now, in my particular case, I've only got 2 sites, so it doesn't make any additional value to make this spine a route reflector, so I'll leave it turned off. So that completes the configuration for site number 1. Now we're going to have to do something very similar for site number 2. So I'm going to click on site number 2, BCN, and I've already pre-configured some site level details here. Remember, we need to have multi-site on. We have to select an overlay multicast TEP, which is pulled from my cheat sheet. I've also chosen to set up the OSPF area settings, which is exactly like I did for site number 1. And clicking down into the pod level, again, I just copied and pasted the overlay unicast TEP from my cheat sheet here. And then clicking down into the spine level configuration for site number 2, again, I just quickly populated all of the information because it's almost the same as what I did in site number 1, except in site number 2, I have a different interface, a different IP address on the spine. I've turned on BGP peering, and I've chosen a BGP eVPN router ID for this spine that lives in site number 2. Now, at this particular point, I've chosen a lot of configuration options, but nothing has yet been pushed to any of these sites until I click the deploy button at the very top. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. So after a few seconds, we're taken back to this particular view of the Infra window, and we can go ahead and close it. Now that we've configured the infrastructure in MSO, let's do a couple of quick checks to see what actually happened in the background. So here I am back in the view of the APIC that's managing site number 1 AMS, and I want to point out a couple of things. First, automatically when you enabled multi-site for a given site, MSO will actually push a little note here up at the top next to the word APIC with the name that you gave your site, in my case AMS. Furthermore, I'm still back in the view of tenant infrastructure, and under the networking area, here we can see that MSO has pushed a fully working intersite layer 3 out. It's actually called intersite. Now, I also want to point out the little tiny icon there, the little gray cloud that's attached to the intersite layer 3 out object. Really what that refers to is it tells you that this is an object that is created and now managed by multi-site. You can see the detailed information here because there's a message at the top that says, hey, this object is configured and owned by multi-site. You should not make configuration changes here in APIC. You should only configure or modify this from MSO from now on. The same thing has actually happened with Barcelona as well. Now back in MSO, there's another thing we can check here as well. So I'm going to click on the section in the left called Dashboard, and we can see we've got our map. Our two sites are actually blinking green, and you can see that we can see some basic information about them. Now, this is the map view. I'm actually going to click on list view in the upper right. Now we can see a slightly different bit of information here about our sites. Not only can we see the version of a code that they're running, but we are more interested in seeing that the connectivity column is showing two green arrows pointing up. Now what does this actually mean? Well, that connectivity column is actually testing for two things. Number one, that the underlay routes have been exchanged and that control plane functions are actually operating as desired. And at the second level, it's also checking that the data plane path is up and functional as well. So if both of those are true and properly configured, you'll see the green arrow. If not, the arrow will be red and down, and you can actually hover over it and click on a message that says, show me the details about what the problem might be. So let's actually move on to backup and migration options. So what I'm going to do is I have my old cluster with a fully working infrastructure config for the two sites that I showed you. What I'm going to start with is I'm going to take a backup file in the old cluster and I'm going to save that file off box. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that file and import this into my brand new cluster. Now this is a new cluster running a different version of MSO.ACI, a different form factor because this is the MSO application running on top of the virtual case or application services engine. Once I've imported that backup, then I can select the option to roll back this configuration, which would then activate this configuration on the new cluster. After that, I'll close out the video by showing you how you can actually upgrade MSO right from the user interface. So with that being said, let's get started on the first option of migrating from the old cluster to the new cluster. So here I am back in my original MSO cluster running 2.2.4, and under the choices on the left, under the admin section, there's an area called backups, and this is what it looks like. Now I'm going to create a new backup here. You can give it a name. You can't use any special characters and it will warn you if you name it something incorrect. So I'll call this, backup 1. You can add some notes. You also have a choice of backing up locally to this MSO or backing up to a remote location. We support SFTP and SCP as options to remote sites. Now just to keep things simple, I'm going to just back up this configuration locally. We can see here that the backup was successfully created and it shows up in the list. Now here on the right you'll see these three little dots. If you click on those three little dots, you can move this to a remote location if you so desire, or you can actually download this to your local laptop, for example, and that's what I'm going to do. Okay, it takes just a second to download, and at this point I want to switch from the old cluster now and log into the new cluster and import this file. So here I am logged into the new MSO cluster, and as you can see here, it's running a beta version of 3.0.0.98. Now this is the cluster that I'm going to migrate my configuration to. Now when you first log in, you'll see that the choices in the left menu bar have changed. The look and feel has changed slightly from earlier versions, so it would be useful for you to click around and familiarize yourself with the new options. So I'm going to click under the operations area, and this is where I'll find the backups and restore, and this is where I'll then import the configuration that I just backed up from the older MSO cluster. So I do that by clicking on the import button and simply uploading the file that I saved locally to my laptop. Okay, here we can see that the backup has been successfully imported here on the 5th of May, and here's my backup file. Now, just like in the previous view of the older cluster, we've got these three little dots on the right, and if I click on that, you can see I've got some options here, and the option that I want to choose here is roll back to this particular backup. Now, when you click on that button, there are a few points of warning that you should read about versions and the fact that by clicking yes, you'll be kicked out of the session as it activates this running config. I'm aware of all of that, so I'm going to go ahead and click yes. Okay, so after a few seconds, I logged out, I logged back in, and now you can see in the brand new cluster that my infra configuration has been properly imported. I'm in the dashboard view here, and you can see I've got my two locations, but what MSO has actually added is another indication that the control and data planes are up between those two sites, as seen by the green line between them. One of the other things that I like about the new MSO is if I click into the infrastructure and infrastructure configuration, again, I get the map view, but here I can click on the list view and see a little bit more detailed information in this newer version that I didn't have before around the connectivity. I can see my green arrows. I can actually see the settings that I chose for each of my sites, and all of that is listed here. So that actually completes the very easy backup and restore and migrating to a new MSO cluster. Now at this point, let's actually close the video by showing you just how easy it is to do an upgrade right through the MSO UI. So we're still in the infrastructure view of my new MSO cluster, and in that same area you can see that there's an option called Firmware Management. So clicking on Firmware Management will give you some basic information, namely the version of MSO code that you currently have running, and we can see that that is 3.0.0.98. Now I want to actually upgrade to a newer version. What I first did was I clicked on Add Image, and I have the option to upload a newer version of the MSO.ACI app either from my local machine or from a remote location supported over HTTP or HTTPS. Now I've already done that to save time. You can see here in the window that I've uploaded 3.0.0.99 and its status is available. I will note that when you first upload the MSO.ACI app, give it a minute or two to process and unpack, and when that's all done, you'll see again the three little dots on the right side of the screen, and if you click on them, you can see you can delete this or activate. Now in my case, I want to activate by selecting activate, which will then take a few minutes, but you can see here that I'll be temporarily interrupted from using MSO while this process happens, but that's okay, that's what I want, and I'll go ahead and click continue. Now it's going to take a couple of minutes and I'm going to have to re-log in, but really that's how easy it is to upgrade the newer version of the MSO right through the user interface. Now that upgrade process did take a few minutes, but after logging back in and going back to the firmware management section, we can see that we are now currently running the newer version of 3.0.0.99, and of course we can check it under the About MSO settings to see that we have successfully upgraded. And that actually concludes the things that I wanted to show you in this companion demo video. Now I'll pass it back to Max for the next video in the series. Thank you very much.